Okay, so I want to talk to you guys about the cell membrane. So here's a picture of a cell, typical animal cell drawing with the nucleus, nucleolus, and the cell membrane. So we're going to focus on the cell membrane, which is that thing that encloses all of the things inside of the cell, all of the organelles. So here we've got our organelles, and they're contained within the cell membrane. And don't forget, all this jelly stuff in here is the cytoplasm. So if I just take a little section here of the cell membrane and just cut it out, I'll get a cross section. Let's take a look at just the membrane part, the sac, what it would look like if the cell, here's all the organelles in here. I'm just going to take a look at the sac, okay? So let's take a look at that. So this is what it looks like. So the organelles are all in here. And this is a cross section. So if I sliced the cell in half like an egg, I would get a cross section. And if you look here, there's all of these molecules that make up the cell membrane. It's very, very complex. And we call this a phospholipid bilayer. And the phospholipid bilayer is two layers, bilayer, made of phospholipids. Okay, so it's a lipid, so it's a fat, and the outside is the phospho part, which is the this bulbous thing here. So there's a phospho there, and then the inside, or the legs, the little bottom portion, is the lipid portion. And the reason that it orients like this is because this is a water environment. Usually cells are mostly water, so in here the cytoplasm is very, very much water, and outside of the cell is very much water. So the phospho part is actually enjoys being in a water environment, and the lipid part despises being in a water environment. Just like oil and water don't mix, phospholipids orient like this. So on the outside, the phosphate group is actually water loving, and we call it hydrophilic. Hydro means water, and philic means loving. And in this part, this lipid part, where the long chains of fatty acids are, we call it hydro for water, hydrophobic, and water fearing or water hating. Okay, and then if we go to look at it a little bit closer, so here's our phospholipid. So here's our phospho, that's the head, and that's the hydrophilic portion. And then this is the tail, the lipid, which is hydrophobic. And if you look, it's non-polar. And you know that water is polar, so polar and non-polar, they don't like each other, they don't mix. And here we have the polar head, which is why this is usually facing the water side. And here's a little cartoon diagram, or a schematic, showing the polar head and the non-polar tails. And don't forget, those are long chains of fatty acids, just like we saw in our macromolecule lesson about lipids. And then here's how they orient themselves. So the outside is the polar, or the phosphate heads, and the inside are the lipid tails. Okay, so here we show the bilayer. Okay, now we'll look at it in a little bit more of a schematic, where if I took the bilayer and I just sliced it down the middle, this is how I would see it: the phosphate head and the lipid tails. Okay. And then we look at these big giant things inside of the cell membrane. These are proteins that it can be transmembrane, which means they cross the membrane, or they can actually just be sitting out on one side. So let's say this is the outside of the cell and this is the inside of the cell. And so the organelles would be all in here. So, you know, your mitochondria, your chloroplast if it's a plant cell, your vacuoles, your ribosomes, your endoplasmic reticulum, all of those things would be in here. And the outside of the cell is the cellular environment. This is where substances that we need to put inside the cell are found, or things that the cell has sent out. So if you have this type of protein usually identifies the cell. So certain hormones and things can come and attach and go, oh yeah, I know, I can recognize this cell. But we're going to be focused on these transmembrane proteins, specifically these ones that have actually a hole in it, or a little passageway. And what you have to understand is that things go into and out of the cell by the cell membrane. The cell membrane, remember, is like the bouncer. It regulates what goes in and what goes out. So things can come in by different pathways. One of the ways that it can go in is by passive transport. And passive transport just means that the things can go in using diffusion. And remember that diffusion is movement from a high concentration to a low concentration. So let's say, for example, we have some substances out here. I'll draw them with triangles. And we need those substances inside of the cell. Well, if those substances are nonpolar, which means they can get through this part of the membrane, they can actually just diffuse through the cell membrane very nicely from a high concentration to a low concentration. So easily transported through the cell membrane. And the cell membrane will sort of allow this passage. And don't forget, it's a fluid mosaic, so it can actually move. These things aren't static. They don't just stay in place. They're not stuck there. So things can get into and out of the cell by passive transport and the process of diffusion. And there's also things that can go through passive transport, but they might be a little bit larger than what would normally be able to go through, or they actually might be polar substances, in which case, if it's polar or a little bit larger than can just squeeze through, we use these protein channels. And these channels allow for these things to go through. So these channels might actually, spread open and allow for these larger molecules to go through. And if they are going from a higher concentration to a lower concentration, we will be able to let it go through diffusion. But this type of diffusion is called facilitated diffusion. That means it gets a little bit of help. So if you facilitate something, you help it. So facilitated diffusion. Okay, so that's when you use a channel to allow substances that wouldn't normally be able to get through the cell membrane. Okay. The next type of transport through a cell membrane is called active transport. And active transport requires energy. And remember, the energy of the cell is ATP. And look at that. Active transport needs ATP. So it needs energy. And the times that the energy is required is when you're moving across the against the concentration gradient. So let's say we've got, remember, this is the inside of the cell and this is the outside of the cell. So if we've got a ton of things inside of the cell, but we still need more, the concentration gradient would normally go from high to low. So it would go from the inside to the outside. But we want to get these things in the cell because we need lots of them. And that's the time that we have active transport. So we usually have something called a pump. And a pump is a protein channel just like this. And it actually allows for these things to get pushed in, but energy is required. So we've got to put some ATP in there to sort of suck these things through and get them into the cell. So active transport is going against the concentration gradient from a low concentration to a high concentration.